Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and we're really excited to be here today. I'm Tatiana Ginsberg. I'm the Director of Artistic Projects and a Master Collaborator here at Dieu Donné. And I have the pleasure today of talking with Sam Moyer, a brilliant artist and a wonderful person to work with in the studio. And I'm really happy that we can both be here together to talk to you about her lab grant residency, which was a year-long project that she worked on together with me and our other studio assistants in the studio. So we'll be diving into that. I want to thank our sponsors for this program who've made it possible, especially the public funds from the National Endowment for the Arts and the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the governor and the New York State Legislature and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, as well as generous foundation and individual support. We can't thank you all enough. It really means a lot to us. So without further ado, we'll dive in here. During the webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, which we will answer as we get towards the end. But feel free to put questions in whenever they come up in your mind. We're happy to take a look at them throughout. And if you would like to turn on automated closed captions, you can do that also at the bottom of your screen. And eventually, in a few weeks, we'll have the webinar up on YouTube so you can watch it again later if you missed anything. So here's Sam and I together in the Dieu Donné studios during her lab grant residency. And I thought it would be nice just to walk through the process a little bit and just show kind of what we did physically. So all of Sam's work in this lab grant residency pretty much started with forming a sheet of paper in what's called a deco box. So here you see me fussing with plastic, pouring pulp in, adding some water, mixing that in with the pulp. This is an abaca pulp that's been beaten for 8 hours in this case. So it'll make a very translucent sheet. And I remove the plastic and shake it a little bit side to side and front to back to make the sheet stronger and interlock the fibers, make it more even. So that's how all of this stuff got made. Then we have the fresh sheet still on the mold, and you can see it's sort of that creamy white will become a much more translucent, paler color once it's dry. And then Sam would go in at that point and score the sheet of abaca to create an image. I feel like this was your favorite part in a way.
Like cake decorating. I've always loved that since I was a kid.
Yes, definitely. So here are some of the tools of the trade: small scrapers, different kinds of tweezers, etc. And this is Sam and studio assistant Margot Bridges getting in there with the cake decorating tools and removing and scraping off sections. So this is not a typical paper making process, but it's one that Sam sort of intuitively came to on her own, of basically starting with a sheet and then taking parts away, making layers. And here we're about to transfer a layer of cotton with a grid pattern onto a background that's already got, looks like at least 2 layers of one cotton and one abaca. And then we couch the sheet, which it means transfer it or lay down, and peek, make sure it's all coming off okay. And then you get these kind of multiple layers stacking on top of each other. And I feel like this was kind of the heart of what you did, Sam, was really thinking about how all those layers would interlock and play on top of one another. And then from there, you would build the next layer, figuring out kind of what would be the next thing that would make sense on top of the previous one. So this was very intuitive, and each of these layers was built up by hand. And here's the finished dry piece. So as it's dry, you can see that the colors kind of unify. The abaca becomes more translucent and a little bit warmer, and you get these different levels of things happening, but they're all physically compressed, so they're all physically flattened in the drying process. And then after every time that you would come into the studio, we would sit down and review the dry work and kind of decide what we liked, what colors were working, what combinations were working, and then kind of design the next set of work based on the last set. So diving back in, sometimes getting inspiration from the way that layers happened in previous pieces. Here's a cotton sheet on the mold in Sam's signature Payne's gray. And then couching that on top of an abaca sheet, layering another sheet of abaca partially over it, another sheet of cotton in a darker color, another sheet of abaca. So building up layer by layer. And then looking at the finished works, I think was always kind of really inspiring. Seeing like what seemed to advance more, what seemed to recede more when you looked at them when they were dry. Paper changes so much wet to dry. There's so much physicality to it in both states, but it's really like a magical process. So here's some examples of the series that Sam developed called Soft Mods. And many of them are grids, but some of them also have circles or arch shapes. That's one of the last ones you did, kind of really breaking the grid.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also worked on a large window piece that was used in your installation at the Hill Art. So this screen that filtered light has been made up of all of these individual sheets, all made the same way, same size, 18 by 24. With each of them is 2 layers of abaca and 2 cotton layers. And this was a big production project for all of us in the studio, including Sam's studio assistants, Mary, Taylor, and Nikki in this picture, Sam and me. And our studio assistants, SR Lejeune on the left, Lauren Kukowski and Alejandra Sevilla on the right, transferring those layers. So each time it was basically 4 different layers of paper for each
And we
sheet.
made 60. How many did we make?
Yeah, I think we made about 60. I kept worrying that we didn't have enough and that we needed to have a lot of options.
Yeah.
And in each of these, we're scraping off the layer by hand, but we did use a jig to sort of give us some regularity and figure out where to score. But each one is like very meticulously layered by hand. And then you guys in your studio built an armature for this and figured out kind of how they would lay on top of one another to create the whole screen.
Yeah, which was a little complicated because it was like merging basic like construction sculpture ideas, but then trying to honor the like archival quality of the paper, and how do we make what we need to make without compromising the integrity of the paper, and how do we keep it mobile and storageable storable.
Horrible. Yeah.
So there was a lot of problem solving, and I'm used to being able to do like whatever I need to do to get something done, but we had to really like honor the labor and the product in the process. So that was a fun is a weird word to choose, but it was a collaboration between
You and the material, right?
and the
Yeah,
studio, beyond just the paper making.
definitely. And each of those materials has the way it wants to behave. So figuring that out. And then you had a show, you had two shows open on the same night, which was definitely very ambitious. One at Sean Kelly, showing the soft mod works together with larger pieces that you'd made in your studio. And I really love how they kind of all moved you through the space and the in this installation at Sean Kelly, and seeing the work that we made together in the context of the other work that you've made is always exciting to me.
Yeah.
And then at the Hill Art, this wonderful Noguchi piece that's being transformed by your intervention with the screen behind it. You can see that you could actually see through the lattice work to the background there.
The screen sort of behaved the same way stained glass would, where during the day the light filled in from the outside and cast the shadows across the room, or just sort of made the abaca glow in contrast to the opacity of the cotton-based paper. And then at night, the interior light of the space would illuminate the piece so you could see it from the street, which was really cool.
It was really beautiful at different times of day as well, which I really loved about this work, that every time you would come back to see it, it would change. And
Yeah,
also,
it's a really temporal quality to it.
yeah, I also love the way that it related then to some of the other soft mods pieces that were in the studio or in the gallery at the same in our studio being made at the same time, but in the gallery they kind of talk to each other as well.
Yeah, it was sort of an in real time example of the concept I was going for with the other soft mod pieces. So soft mod was just a shortened name of soft modern that I was thinking about original like modernist photography when I was making these works. I studied photography as my entry into the art world. And I was a master printer. And so I was very invested in like Stieglitz and Steichen and Weston and these craft masters. And just thinking back on that moment when photography sort of entered the language of fine art, and this evaluation of the world around us and this abstract interpretation of light and shadow, and sort of using the camera as a tool to discover the ready-made and composition in that sense. And so with these works, I was really thinking about the materials lending to rendering light and shadow and opacity and density. And then with all my work, I'm always trying to cross-pollinate between like sculpture and photography and drawing. And I knew nothing about paper when we started this. So once I started to understand the makeup of the material, I was like, well, this is they sort of emerged on their own, and then the idea came to me as we were working on them. Like the material was a big advocate for itself in the process. I didn't come in with this plan and manipulate the material into my agenda. It sort of emerged into like my thought process as I was handling the material itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to me because we sort of just found this way, I offered you various things, but you really just found a way of working that worked for you very immediately and intuitively. We tried a couple of different other ways of building up images with pulp painting and embossing, things like that. But
Mhm.
this sort of method that you developed, it's not a typical paper making method. And we could have done a blowout or something, but there wouldn't have been this sort of call and response intuitive process with that.
Mhm.
And I feel like that was really central to what you were thinking and doing. And it was really also fascinating to me as we went along in the process, how each work kind of built on the previous set of works. So, we would have a session or two days or something, and then look at it dry, see what happened. And then you would kind of build off of, this lexicon of ideas essentially, and building kind of blocks of ways of working. How many layers do we need to really have something transform? Does 3 layers work? Does 5 layers work? What works for each piece, but also like what can we learn about the material as we go along? And as long as I've been making paper and working with artists, I've never had somebody work in quite the way that you just intuitively worked. So that was really fun for me. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I came in so blind. I was a little intimidated to come in because at this point in my career, I'm used to sort of being like, okay, I know what's going on and everybody follow me. But then there was just so much freedom to just hand myself over to like naivete and like I don't know, I have to follow what you say. I'm totally shooting in the dark here. But then there is the positive of having consistently worked a certain way for so long that I do have my own systems that I've created that can kind of apply to any art supply. And those systems, if I always forget they exist. I lose confidence in knowing that I've like developed this internal language until it's time to like get down to business and it emerges. And I think this was a good concrete example of that for me because I came in so blind and it emerged.
yeah, definitely. And then I really love also just thinking about how this relates, like your systems, with all the tools that you have, how this relates to some of the other pieces that you had in these two shows, and sort of seeing them leading you to, like, for example, this really large piece. I remember when we first started working, 18 by 24, I kept saying, well, we could scale up because I know you work big or whatever. And you said, anything that you offer me is still small for me. So we sort of decided to make smaller works, but also make modular things so that we could, have flexibility. And I think,
Exactly. It's like these pieces are the exact same scale as the individual pieces that made up the larger installation piece. So everything ends up becoming a building block. And in a way, it has this like egalitarian quality to it where like these happen to be like framed as individual special pieces, but the work that are the building blocks of the larger piece have just as much effort, same material, same quality, which is a very similar idea to like the stoneworks I do, where it's a marble countertop, whether you're making a peanut butter sandwich on it or it's in a painting. Like it's the same material, it's just in a different display. So you're giving it a hierarchy based on how it's being brought to you.
yeah, and I love that sort of I think that material sensibility like really comes through everything. You know, the pulp is so malleable and you can kind of do so much with it. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, making a peanut butter sandwich, really. You can and you can kind of make it work for you, but also it has its own material properties, just like marble, just like any of the things that you're using.
Yes, exactly. It's like very essential.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, and then, you know, the wet versus dry thing is always so fascinating to me, just sort of looking at this last image here and thinking about it, kind of like you really built up a sculpture and then it becomes a two-dimensional work. But it's really this kind of process of layering and seeing how much you want to add, and seeing how each thing kind of behaves on top of the other thing. There's like just so much physicality to it, even though it ends up as a two-dimensional work.
Yeah, and there's also a little bit of loss and reveal, like those two feelings. Where my favorite part of photography was always the reveal, the moment of development, the moment of like seeing what you have. And so it's the same with paper where you can have a sense of what you have, but the color and the flatness change the composition so much. You really, it's a surprise to like come back to the studio and see what things look like when they've dried. But there's also the loss where it's so rich and beautiful in its texture when it's wet. Um, but then there's a whole new level of beauty when it's dry and like the light can move through it and it becomes sort of this object. That was the one thing that was sort of a bummer with having to frame those pieces, is that they exist as three-dimensional objects in such a beautiful way with the light moving through them. Um, Still problem solving that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough challenge. Works on paper in general, but also these very translucent pieces, like that.
Like seen best held in your own hands.
Yeah, exactly. Probably in the ideal world, you would have a way to show them on a wall and also pick them up. And what about the Payne's gray? I mean, that color that you use so successfully in so much of your work, and we had many like versions of those grays.
Yeah.
But I feel like that thematically is something so important in your work. And we talked a little bit about this before the webinar, but you were saying also limiting the palette was important in kind of developing these pieces.
Limiting palette in general is really important to me. I am definitely a freedom within boundaries art maker, and I'm slightly overeducated in art, and so I tend to create a format for myself, like a discipline to work within, but then I need to rebel against it. But if I don't give myself something to rebel against or push against, it's like I'm in a free fall. It's too many options. The buffet of life is too grand, and I don't know where to go. So, you know, I was watching my husband, Eddie, also had this residency, and he would use every single color, and the palette was so exciting. And you would just get this like feast of beautiful colors. And I think my first day in there, I was like, I want all of it. And you almost want to eat it. It's just like so beautiful. But then for my actual self and how I work, I have to like put some parameters around things. And I just didn't know where to start. So to start, I had to be like, well, I make these paintings. I limit my palette with Payne's gray, and I have a reason for that. And Payne's gray is like this beautiful neutral tone that reminds me of like the middle gray of photography that is sort of like the ultimate test of balancing light and darkness. And it's also this beautiful color of right after the sun sets, but before it's completely dark, where the contrasts are really illuminated, but also everything flattens out. So it's the hope and morning and end and beginning, and it because it has a little bit of blue in it, there's like this depth and beauty to it that you can expand it darker or lighter, and it really exists in sort of this it's a very emotional color to me. And so I had to start somewhere. So I was like, well, let's just base it on Payne's gray and then create a little bit of a spectrum from dark to light to go back to like my roots of photography and painting. And then we'll go from there because I can't handle the option of everything.
I think you could handle it. I think it was a really smart choice, though. It really kind of made everything, it made it possible to think about the form in a different way, just to
Yeah.
sort of like have the palette limited. And before I get out of this screen share, I wanted to just go back for a second and ask you about sort of the choice of the Noguchi sculpture and thinking about the space that you created through the light and through the treatment of the window with your work projecting onto that work.
So when we were talking yesterday about this seminar and trying to figure out how this idea came to be, we were both sort of stumped as to the very beginning of it.
Yeah.
I know that I was offered the Hill Foundation show, and I was in, I think, sort of the beginning phases of really getting a handle on our residency at the same time. And part of the residency is thinking about how to show the work and where the work is going to go. And I thought, well, let's make this real. If I'm committing my time to this and this new practice, let's really incorporate it into my, studio practice and my future work versus like making a body of work that was just isolated and like showed in a solo show or an art fair booth or something. So I knew I had this Hill Foundation show coming up. And part of the Hill Foundation is that they ask you to curate from their personal collection and integrate your work into that curation. And I was so excited because I knew that they had some amazing Noguchis, and they had this Noguchi called Woman with Holes that I had never seen before. It was one of the more sensual Noguchis I'd ever seen. And so when I saw that piece and the name of Woman with Holes just felt so dramatic and intense to me. And the Hill Foundation is in a building that was condos. So it's actually set up and it feels kind of like a home where you have smaller spaces that lead to larger spaces. And I just had this idea of let's create this central character, this woman with holes that's in this room. And so when you walk into the show, it was going to be this, it was this single figure in a room. And then I was thinking about how do I have a moment of interacting with this Noguchi? How do I sort of have this post-mortem collaboration? And light has always been a very big part of my work. My dad was in the movie business and he was a lighting designer. And so thinking about how to interact with the architecture of the space, have the light perform a role and also become the source of collaboration, I realized that this would be a great opportunity to use the paper to do this. I wish I could remember the like aha moment. I can't. I just remember thinking like,
Neither.
made the grid. I was like, this would make a beautiful screen. And then knowing that like light would fill through the screen and that there would be an incredible pattern to it. And I wanted it to look like when we did the jigs, we had 4 different jigs that had slightly different patterns because I wanted it to really feel like a drawing, like a hand-drawn grid floating in the air. And then, yeah, it magically worked in this room. We made it to scale. We figured out how to attach it all. And it was spring. So there was this perfect, and we were lucky we had some pretty good sunny days, but there was this about a 2-hour window where you would just get this magnificent pattern shot across the room. And it actually was pretty subtle in these photos. It was more dramatic and intense in real life. But I sort of liked how temporary it was. I mean, often I'd be doing tours and like showing people photos on my phone, like, look, no, I swear the grid works. But I don't know. I think that that's also an incredible thing to just sort of timing. Like, if you want to see it, you have to show up at this time, or you're lucky if you catch it. And if you miss it, you miss it. So
And
anyway,
also then you want to come back, then you want to
yeah.
see it at different times of day. I mean, I felt very lucky to have seen it at several different times of day and even what the streetlights do at night or in something like that, it's just a whole different experience every time you go.
Oh yeah, it was
And
cool when sirens would go by,
yeah, yeah.
like the red pattern across.
And also just that you could see just a little hint of the city behind was really kind of interesting. Just the other buildings across the street and all of that was really sort of magical and really transformed the space. And then the other works that you picked in the show, like the Gober and other things that kind of all came together out of just looking at the Hills collection, right?
Yeah, just sort of thinking about, well, first it was just me choosing my favorite artist that I was really excited to show with. And then thinking about this idea, I kept joking that it was a haunted house show, but just this idea of the impossible domestic interior exterior space where it's like defying, every object is defying reality but still suggesting it at the same time and slightly altering your preconceived notions of how something should work. And you approach it thinking you know what it is, and then a moment later, through its like material shift, you have to reconsider what you thought you knew.
Yeah. I think it was just such a rich show from, so many perspectives of being able to see your work in these beautiful spaces, and the Sean Kelly show as well, just sort of, this expansiveness. Or I feel like these works are very generous in that way. They like give you space to move around and think.
Yeah, they're like neutral enough to project on, but have enough information to have a personality.
Yeah. I hope we are all like that, maybe. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share. And if people have questions, please put them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll kind of read a few of them. We have a couple already that I'll start with. So we have a question. How did you join all of the panels to make the window screen? Is that proprietary secret knowledge or?
No, I just wish I remembered the like technical names. It was a special tape that you guys recommended, and we created, and magnets. So we were making these little pockets of, I don't know what the paper's called, some kind of like archival little paper. And then we would put the magnet inside the pocket and then use a very specialized glue to glue the pocket. I'm not doing a good job explaining this, but every corner basically had a pocket with a tiny magnet in it. And we could hold 4 pieces together with the magnets so before the weight started to like really pull down on the paper. And then those 4 pieces were magneted.
Yeah, magnetically attached.
Magnetically attached to a frame. So behind, and we had to create the frame so that they really hid behind the opaque parts of the works. So I wish I could remember the numbers. Let's say there's like 12 frames, 4 pieces per frame, something like that.
Yeah, there was a lot of trial and error with that, and sort of thinking about how to let the material still behave the way it wants to, like paper.
Yeah, like have some motion, but not too much motion. We didn't want things to curl. We didn't want it to fall. We didn't want it to buckle too much. Yeah, it was fun. We had to, figure it out. I love problem solving.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the decision to use magnets was also brilliant, because then, it gave you flexibility to change it, to reinstall it.
Completely adaptable. Yeah. And also we can store it in a box that's the size of a single sheet, which is huge, because a piece like that often like you end up storing yourself. And
yeah, I wonder if you've experienced that. Yeah. So I'm sure that's a lot to figure out.
The great thing about paper too is it's like this is pretty substantial sculpture that, can go in a flat file.
Yeah, which is kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And we originally, when we were first working, we did do some embossing or some more like sculptural paper kinds of things, but there wasn't in a way a need for that with you, because I feel like you have so many tools already for making more dimensional work that you didn't really need paper to do that for you.
It also felt like we tried to make these sort of nostalgic works with like collected objects at one point, like sticks my kid had collected, or these rocks from Indiana. And it was so much about the object and not about the paper. And the truth is that my work is really about a relationship with the material, not the material being subservient to an idea. So, which I kind of talked about earlier. So
Yeah.
it was fun, but it wasn't hitting the nail on the head for something that was expansive enough to keep doing.
Yeah, I agree. It felt like a good experiment, but it didn't feel like it was offering you anything that you couldn't get through another means that you already had at your disposal.
Yeah.
And the same with the pulp painting in a way. The pulp painting was fun, and you could certainly have kept doing them, and perhaps you will, but it didn't offer you something that you couldn't get in another way. I feel like this way of working that you developed in the residency was really specific to paper. It took paper's inherent qualities and made a lot of use of them, how
Yeah.
each of those materials behaved and how they behave together.
And I think we developed kind of a system that feels sustainable but also expansive. So if we wanted to continue this project or do more, we have a springboard.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like this could, continue and expand from here in different directions. But I feel like by the end of the residency, you really had a good flow and a really good understanding of the materials. And even though there's always a surprise when things are dry versus wet, there was a way that we could really build on it. We weren't completely shooting in the dark. We were really working from some base of knowledge that felt, very solid and comfortable.
Yeah.
We have a question about drying. Do you use a forced air dry system under weight to keep the grid papers flat? And yes, I didn't put a picture of that, but it's a pretty standard way of drying paper, just under weight, under pressure with a fan behind it. So a forced air drying system. And that was very important because we have materials that we did do some experiments. I totally forgot about until this moment, but we did do some experiments with different types of drying, which gave different types of texture. So if we allowed for partially air drying or drying under less pressure, we got some cockling and some shrinkage of the abaca against the cotton. But it didn't feel like it was really doing anything to add to the pieces. That sometimes works well with certain kinds of work, but in this case, I feel like it it was sort of a distraction rather than an addition.
Yeah.
We have another question, which is, would you ever combine your stonework with paper pulp to create a 3D sculpture or relief?
I think that was what the idea we went in with. Sure.
Yeah, I could see that at some point. I could see a possible way of you coming back to doing just the way that you combined marble and canvas and paint, or combine marble with masonite or other types of materials. I could see you having also elements of things that would be maybe made in different materials.
Yeah. Right now, this is probably like TMI, but like my thought just thinking about that is part of what makes the marble works work is having the negative space or the counterpart have a similar weight, where when the contrast is too extreme, it gets a little too decorative, or the marble needs a competitor. It needs to exist within something versus just being the star of the show. So with the paper, we would have to figure out some kind of sculptural way that it really challenged the stone or balanced it out.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think there's a really, you're doing already so many things with marble in so many different ways that
Yeah.
you'd have to find something that you couldn't already do. That
Right.
the
It would
paper
be
would.
just like replacing the painting with paper, and then it's sort of why.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Why? Um, Here's a slightly weird question that you don't have to answer because I'm putting you on the spot, but do you feel like being at Dieu Donné, physically being at Dieu Donné, was an influence in any way on the work, like the studio environment, that just being in a different space? Um, would you have made that same work if you were somehow able to do it in your own studio? I know we talked a little bit at one point about like the windows at Dieu Donné and some of the grid patterns that you see when you're there.
Yeah.
But do you think there's something that happened in the studio process of being here with us that changed the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that uh, the process of making art is a very influenceable state to be in. Um, I'm like a highly influenced person, highly influenceable. And there was a quietness to the studio. There was like a patience to it. I think that the energy of making the work matched the energy of the studio. Like if I was in some kind of, uber masculine sculpting style studio, I probably would have made some huge paper pulp. It's like, it's just, you sort of match the energy of the environment. And yeah, looking out at those windows and looking at the repetitive light and pattern of the Navy Yard definitely brought in those patterns of those early modernist photography photographs. And yeah, you need a place to start. So what do? You look around at your built environment around you. And so, yeah, I think I started to just sort of mimic the patterns that were in the room, and the sort of quiet precision style of making was echoing the vibe for sure. And it was nice because I like that contrast. It's like some of my work is incredibly physical, and you got to like hype yourself up to do it. And this was nice. It was like this. I mean, library is the place I keep going, where it's sort of like you're on your own, but you can also be in community in a library. And that's sort of what it felt like at Dieu Donné, where it's like you could be in your own space, zoning out. I wanted to create something like repetitive but intuitive, but then there's also a huge portion of it that was collaborative and very peaceful. So I feel like the work emerged from all of those feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just sort of interesting because in some ways, maybe this is just a question, it's a curiosity for me because it's sometimes invisible to me. But then I also think about, other things that we talked about in the studio and like Katsura Villa in Kyoto, and that being kind of an influence. Because at one day I sort of naively was like, these kind of remind me of Katsura, and you're like, I'm all about Katsura. I know all about it. I, love it. It's so much a part of your consciousness already. But those like little things, those kind of finding quiet moments in the spaces, allowed us to kind of also develop a dialogue together where we were like, as you said, working separately but together. a lot of the time you and I were in the studio alone or with one assistant, even though a lot of the photos that I showed have many assistants because we were working on the grid piece. And once we decided to be working on the screen, that was like, more hands the better. But there were many days where, especially in the beginning, we just kind of, it was a very slow meditative process.
Hmm.
Just took the time that it took.
Yeah, and you were a great influence on me with that because I tend to get like insecure and need to rush things or feel like I'm supposed to like get it already. And you were incredibly patient with me. But I think having a similar, like you understanding the aesthetic that I was coming from and reaching for, and learning that you'd spent all that time in Kyoto and like knew so much more about the things I was interested in than I did.
Yeah.
I feel like you were a really good guide in the sense of um, giving me just enough information, like just enough to keep it going, but also giving me total permission to be like, if this is what this is also okay. Like, you know.
Yeah. I mean, that's always such an interesting balance in the studio with different artists. And I feel like I learn as much from the artists as they learn from me, just different ways of that people work and how you can kind of discover something new in a process that you've been doing for 30 odd years or whatever, because you
Yeah.
have somebody working with you who is discovering it in a new way and bringing everything that they already know about how to make art to this process that for me is very familiar, but for you is a sort of discovery process.
Yeah. But it never seemed like you were in a rush. You were always like, well, we'll try more. We'll try again. We'll add
Yeah.
more color. It's okay. It felt really good to have someone being like, it's okay.
Yeah, and I think the pieces really show that too, that we took time to sort of layer and develop things. And even a few of them we re-embedded. There were a couple that we thought weren't good when they were dry, and then we brought them back in the wet studio and added to them. And that was fun too, just to sort of think about it being not a one-way street, but going back and forth. There were some days where we only made three pieces because, they became complex and it took time. And but they were really strong works in the end. And I think they show kind of that time and investment in just being physically present. Because I
Yeah.
think that's something special about the way that you work that I've noticed working with you is that you really want to be there physically with your hands and your body
Yeah.
present with the work. You don't want to pass everything off to get it done faster. You want it to sort of show, I remember talking even about like the grids where we all were working on them, figuring out how to get them to be regular but irregular, allow everybody to do them each in their own way, but also have your aesthetic and not be too ragged and not be too clean, just finding that kind of balance. And I think it was really helpful that you kind of knew what you were about with that. You wanted people to have flexibility, but also, not make it look too random.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say that one of my favorite things about a failure, like when you see a piece and it's awful, is then you know that you actually genuinely like the other works.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
that's
I
true.
feel so badly about this one. I must feel pretty good about the other piece.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think that's a very good point. And we did have a few that we were like, oh, this isn't good, or,
Not hit.
like this is not hitting it, this is not doing it for me. And
Yeah.
then we would both kind of try to figure out why. And even the materials, because early on we experimented with maybe we used linen in abaca, or maybe we used, only cotton or only abaca or things like that. Sort of
Yeah.
finding those combinations was interesting. We have another question. Um, did you ever consider adding a couple or a singular organic form to your grids? And in some ways, you did add other kinds of forms, but those were then not grid pieces in a way.
Yeah, I think that's more of the like freedom within boundaries. Like I have a system going on. I have sort of an intuitive engineering and geometry going on. I'm not using any rulers. I'm not using any math. I'm almost trying to get it right and then hysterically getting it wrong. And um, to just randomly put an organic shape in there wouldn't work for me unless it was like an accident that happened in process. Uh, because I need to know why. I can't just justify anything.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me because I think you're sort of building one thing off the next. So it has to have that connection and
Yeah,
intersection.
yeah.
And, there were one or two cases where I do remember us like inserting kind of like an elliptical shape or something, but it was very much of a veiling layer
Yeah.
of thin abaca or something, where it
Mhm.
changed how you perceived it, almost like light changing through a window,
Exactly.
um, and not
Yeah.
something that felt like artificial to it. It felt really part of it.
Yeah.
Um, well, we're coming close to the end of our webinar time. And before we sign off, I just wanted to ask if there's anything that you wish that we had done that we should do the next time we get you in. Is there any kind of like thing that we didn't explore? I mean, what would be the sort of logical next step, in a way? Because obviously we learned so much from this process about ways that you could build these images. But is there something that you're like, oh, I think we could go there?
I mean, I think that it's really trying to figure out how to balance the sculpture drawing quality of these and have light move through them. And so, I mean, on the spot, the first thing I can think of is sort of like scaling up a little bit, complicating the patterns a little bit, and figuring out how to mount them in some kind of frame where they hang inside the frame and light can actually move through them, whether that's like they're double-sided objects or they exist somehow slightly off the wall, but they exist in a semi weird land between 2D, 3D, somewhere between the framed pieces and the screen.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating thing to think about, especially now having finished that screen, like everything you learned about how that operated and working with it as a material that was a finished dry material, ready to use.
I also think it could be, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was also like using it more as architectural space too, like using more screens that are two-sided where you're building like walls or things they have to walk around um, with the paper.
Yeah. Yeah, if you had another installation even of the screen work that you made, you might use it in a really different context where it divided a space instead
Yeah.
of having it be kind of against the window. So
Mhm.
that's also like a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Where like things sort of then we're like cross-pollinating between architectural architecture, sculpture, and drawing all at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of like, I think what is really strong in your work is that you're operating at that kind of intersection of those things and
Yeah.
thinking about space, thinking about building things, in relationship to light.
Yeah.
Um,
But also having the shadow be so much part of the piece, like if we were to make larger pieces that existed on some kind of frame away from the wall and then had specific directions for lighting it, or it existed in a room, it could almost work like a timepiece in a room where the shadow behind it would move and change with the light during the day.
that would be beautiful. I'd be down for doing that.
Here we go. Got a plan.
Okay, we got a plan.
In real time, folks.
Yes. Well, Thank you all for joining us, and thank you especially, Sam, for being here today. I know you've just gotten back from Miami and lots of big studio projects in the works. So thank you for your time and being here with us. And thanks for working with me.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for teaching me how to make paper.
Anytime.